This is Healthy Starts Early, a podcast about eating healthy as a family. I am your host, Sarah Rusing, founder of the Phoebe app and passionate advocate of healthy eating at home. A quick disclaimer, our content is for informational purposes only and should not be taken as a healthcare advice. If you have any concerns over the health and well-being of your child, please contact your GP or health visitor. Now let's enjoy the next episode. Today I'm joined by Aliya Porter, an experienced and registered nutritionist who runs the Weaning Centre in Porter Nutrition. Alia has over 15 years' experience working with charities and businesses and the NHS to help people to improve their health by eating well. She has 3 children, which has helped her to understand firsthand some of the challenges faced by parents when it comes to weaning and healthy eating. And in 2021, she published Weaning on a Budget, an ebook that is designed to help you through the weaning journey without breaking the bank. You can find the link to Alia's ebook and her websites in the show notes of this episode on our website, phoebeapp.com. So, Alia, my first question is that lots of listeners will have heard that people say food under one is just for fun. Is this really true?
No, it's not. It's more complex than that. If you just think about weaning under one just being just for fun, then you miss out on a window of opportunity to introduce lots of different foods, but also to set those really good foundations for later life. But we don't want to add pressure to people. So there is supposed to be fun in there, but it's not just for fun.
And could you tell us why awareness of nutrition is so important in those early days?
So it's important to lay good foundations right from the very start. It's not just from the point that we introduce solids that those foundations are laid. So it might be through breastfeeding and through flavours passing from mum into the breast milk. But also if you're bottle feeding, actually the patterns that you set around feeding will help them to develop patterns, helpful or not unhelpful patterns in later life. In terms of awareness of nutrition, actually knowing what good nutrition is can help us to offer the right foods to our children from those early days. So it might be that you're very familiar with what a healthy diet is for an adult, but it is different for children. So knowing what to offer is helpful. Those habits are forming right from the beginning. So actually the foods that we're offering and the way that we're offering them will help them to develop good foundations. There are also lots of vital nutrients that they need to be getting right from the beginning. So for example, iron, by the point they're 6 months, their iron stores will have depleted from birth. And so actually we need to start getting some iron-rich foods into their diet. So that awareness of and understanding of nutrition is really important.
And what should parents be aiming to include in the first stages of weaning?
So lots of different things. So there are things that you shouldn't have, and there's a whole list of things that you shouldn't have. But there is really important to have variety in those early stages. Lots of people like to start with fruit and vegetables, particularly thinking about the bitter vegetables. So things like broccoli or cabbage or cauliflower are those bitter vegetables. But it's not just vegetables and fruits that you can start off with. We also want to encourage the children to have a range of protein foods, so things like meat, fish, eggs, nuts, as long as they're ground or in nut butter form. Pulses, so things like chickpeas and lentils, and then also having that kind of variety of carbohydrate foods, so things like potatoes or rice, pasta, bread, really important for variety. Some iron-rich foods, so things like red meat or oily fish or nuts. Dark green leafy vegetables have some iron in them, as do fortified cereals. So breakfast cereals are a good way to get iron into babies, making sure they're not high salt options, obviously. And then full fat dairy. So we don't want babies to be having low fat dairy products until they're 2. They need to be having those full fat products. Then they can go on to the lower fat and then onto skim from 5, but initially they need to have full fat dairy products. So it's really about having variety, avoiding things like honey, avoiding things like added sugar, added salt, foods that are likely to increase risk of food poisoning as well, but they should be aiming for that real variety. Another common myth within this, though, is that whole grains are really healthy for babies. So actually they should be having some whole grains, but not at every meal. So like I said previously, the diet for a healthy adult is slightly different to a diet for a healthy little one.
That's really interesting that you're mentioning the whole grain, because I remember always having been advised by health visitors and dietitians actually to opt for the whole grain version of pasta, for example, and bread. Could you maybe just give us a snippet of what happens if babies have too much whole grain? Is it the fiber, or what is it that is not so healthy for a small child?
Absolutely, for a couple of reasons there, because if you have a whole grain, it's likely to fill you up and keep you fuller for longer, which is great for an adult and great for an older child. So from 2+, they can be having whole grains at each meal and should be ideally having that. But little babies have very small stomachs. That's why they need to eat quite frequently. And if you fill their stomach up with something quite heavy like a whole grain, or too much in the way of pulses, so that beans, lentils, things like that, then they don't have enough space for all the other things that they need. And so they don't actually get enough energy in their tummies, their tiny tummies at each meal. Also, the way that the fibre works in the stomach and in the intestine is that it doesn't allow for the absorption of some nutrients in the way that we want that to be. So, for example, for iron, it might reduce the iron absorption. And obviously I mentioned we need to have iron-rich foods going into babies, particularly as they develop new blood as they grow. So yeah, it's really important to have some whole grains, but not whole grains at every meal, just because of that heaviness of baby's diet.
And some parents might find it overwhelming to include all of these foods in a baby's diet within a day. So what would your advice be? Can we look at a whole week where we look at a healthy, balanced diet for such a small child?
Absolutely. So we can get overwhelmed with nutrition generally. And a nutritionist or a dietitian's probably studied for at least 3 years at a degree level to tell you all about it. So we don't want you to feel overwhelmed. Definitely, it can be across the week. Ideally, we are trying to get in 5 different fruits and vegetables across a day, and we're aiming for variety of proteins and carbohydrates, like I talked about. When I say a portion of vegetables, or 5 vegetables, or 5 fruits in total, we're thinking about a handful. So it's not masses and masses. But sometimes it can be helpful to write those things down and plan out what you're going to do. This is not right from 6 months. So at 6 months, we're talking about tiny tastes. And if you think about tastes rather than meals, it can take the pressure off a bit. So you're just trying to get them used to different flavours, different textures. And as they build up, and probably about 8 months, they'll be having 3 different things a day, or 3 different meal times a day. They'll be adding in more and more as the time goes on. But think about 5 different fruit and vegetables, some carbohydrates at each meal, and some protein at each meal. And then across the week, a bit like with adults, we're saying 2 portions of fish a week rather than working out per day. Then that kind of reduces it. Yeah. And really, I think it's really important to remember that babies are going to be needing you for lots of different things, not just food. And if we put too much pressure on food preparation and making meals look absolutely perfect, it's going to be overwhelming. So actually thinking about simple things that you can do. If you're eating carrots with your meal, maybe you could cook some carrot batons to go with baby's meal and have some extra for the next day. Or if you're able to use the freezer and have those options as well, that can kind of reduce the risk of spending ages in the kitchen.
Let me take a quick break and tell you about our great app Phoebe that gives you all the inspiration for cooking healthy food for your family. Phoebe is currently free to use, so make sure you get it today. The link is in the show notes. And if you find this episode helpful, please give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts to help more parents discover it. Now, let's get back to our episode. what is the effect, or what can delaying solids mean for a small child? I know that, sometimes you say, food under one, not just for fun. Then there's also kind of taking off the pressure of the parents, and people think like, oh, it doesn't matter if I don't start solids right away at 6 months. What kind of effects can it have on a small child?
So in terms of thinking about kind of what they actually need, if we don't give them the nutrients that they do need, that's going to affect their growth and their development. And in more extreme cases, things like their bones won't develop properly, their growth might be slower, and their brain development might be slower. Obviously, those are extreme cases, so I don't want to panic you. But actually, this shouldn't add pressure, but it's an important reminder that it's not just for fun at this point. They do need that nourishment alongside their milk. Initially, the milk is going to be providing most of their nutrients, but things alongside it, like iron, for healthy blood, like iodine, certain nutrients are really, really important. And if they don't have those things, then that's going to delay their development. Also, there is research that suggests that if you delay the introduction of allergens beyond 6 months, so if you kind of don't introduce things like nuts or wheat, things like that, if you don't put those in, then that can actually increase your risk of developing an allergy later on. So it's important to try and introduce those foods initially. It can be a bit nerve-wracking introducing an allergen food, but try and do that as early as you possibly can. So the kind of general recommendation, unless there are allergens in the family, which means that the recommendations are slightly different, but for the general population is to introduce them from 6 months. So that might be adding a little bit of peanut butter that's not got added sugar, added salt, onto the end of your finger and letting them suck it off your finger. Or it might be giving them a small piece of bread and trying to help them with that process. So definitely don't delay textures either, because that will increase fussiness too. So there's a whole host of different things about delaying and the problems with delaying, because you want to get that kind of acceptance of food going to reduce fussiness.
You just mentioned allergens. So we actually had a parent question that kind of links in a little bit with this. And the parent was asking she's interested in the tension between exposing babies to a wide range of foods and flavors at the beginning, but also being cautious if your baby has already some known allergens. And how do you get it right, the tension between offering foods and at the same time being cautious? And this mother also heard that a lot of people have been advised to offer 3 days in a row the same food to see if there's any reactions.
So in terms of allergens, the advice is slightly different depending on whether you have a known allergen or not. As I mentioned before, there are details on my website. There's a blog with links that will go into more detail around that. But in terms of the 3 days in a row, it's important to introduce allergens one at a time. And if you want to introduce them over 3 days, that's fine. That does give you a bit more of an indication as to whether they've had a reaction just as a one-off or kind of repeated reaction. But it's really, really important that you don't introduce it at the same time as another known allergen. Any food could be an allergen, but there are 14 common allergens. So it's worth knowing what those are and introducing those one at a time. Yeah. In terms of getting their variety, yes, it's hard to get variety, but it really helps to write it down. So in terms of the kind of 100 foods idea, 100 foods before one, it's great to introduce that variety of foods, but repeat exposure is also really important, because babies need to learn which foods are acceptable and safe. And you may find, particularly after they get to one, they'll fit certain foods that they will only accept if they're cooked a certain way. So they might only like carrot battens rather than carrots cut into small cubes, or they might only like a certain shape of pasta and not another shape of pasta. And that's about being familiar with that type of food. So that repeat exposure is important for not just allergens, it's important for all foods, and then variety mixed in with that. So yeah, by all means, write it down what you're having, so you can keep track of what you're giving. but the 100 foods don't necessarily help us in this process.
A lot of mothers, they spend a lot of time on Instagram these days, and they see many people posting the 100 foods or the first 100 foods that their little ones has eaten. So I think there can be a bit of an artificial pressure almost to introduce loads of different foods before your child turns 1 year old.
Absolutely. Yeah, and a lot of those 100 foods lists are not foods that we would necessarily recommend for children. So there'll be things on there like croissants and pizza and chicken nuggets and all sorts. And a lot of the foods might be high in salt, high in sugar, which is not recommended for weaning. There is a 100 foods list on my website, and that includes things like 100 different fruits, vegetables, protein foods, carbohydrates, just so you can actually remember what you could include. Because I think sometimes we get stuck on, we're always eating broccoli and peas and carrots, and actually there's so many different vegetables out there. So it can be helpful to have a prompt. But yeah, definitely don't get stuck on I've got to have 100 foods, and be really aware of what's on those lists, because not all of it is really acceptable or appropriate, should I say, for babies.
It's so rich in information what you've just shared with us. So I'll make sure that I put all the links for the parents and carers on our show notes site. So thank you so much for making the time to speak to us, Alia. And obviously, if somebody would want more information, they would have to visit the Weaning Centre. Is that the best place to get in touch with you?
Yes, or I'm on Instagram.
We'll share that in the show notes for our listeners. And thank you so much for your time. And it was great speaking to you.
You're very welcome, Sarah. It's been fun.
Thank you so much for tuning in today. Make sure you download our app, which provides free recipes and weaning tips for families with young children. Look for Phoebe on the App Store. That's PHOEBE. And if you found this episode helpful, please give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts to help more parents discover it. That's it for today.